Welcome to the Discourse Analyzer AI Toolkit, where articles come alive. You're listening to the audio version of our article. For the full text and an interactive experience, check out the link in the description below. Interact with any selection using our AI assistant to enhance your understanding. Let's explore.
Identity formation in discourse analysis. Identity formation in discourse analysis examines how individuals and groups construct, negotiate, and express their identities through language. Discourse, as a form of social practice, is not just a medium for communication but a powerful tool in shaping how people understand themselves and their place in society. Through discourse, individuals position themselves in relation to others, adopt or resist social roles, and align with or challenge cultural norms. In discourse analysis, identity is seen as fluid, dynamic, and context-dependent, shaped by the interactions, power relations, and ideologies embedded in language. 1. The role of discourse in identity construction. Discourse is central to identity construction because it is through language that people define who they are and how they relate to others. Identity is not a fixed trait but something that is continuously performed and renegotiated through interactions. Discourse analysis focuses on how these performances are structured by societal norms, power relations, and cultural expectations. Positioning theory. Positioning theory is a key concept in discourse analysis that explains how people position themselves and others in conversation. By adopting certain linguistic choices, individuals take on roles and positions within a given social context. This process of positioning involves claiming or resisting particular identities, as well as attributing identities to others. Example: in a classroom setting, a teacher may position themselves as an authority figure by using formal language and directive speech acts, while students may be positioned as learners through their use of questions or deferential language. The teacher's authority and the student's subordination are constructed and maintained through these discourse practices. Identity is a social and relational process. In discourse analysis, identity is seen as relational, formed through social interactions rather than existing independently. People construct their identities in relation to others, aligning or contrasting themselves with specific social groups, categories, or roles. This relational aspect of identity is key to understanding how discourse operates as a site of both self-expression and social negotiation. Example: in workplace discourse, an employee might align themselves with management by adopting professional jargon and referencing company goals, while distinguishing themselves from colleagues who use more informal or critical language. Here, identity is constructed in relation to the organization's culture and the hierarchical structure within the workplace. Point 2. Multiple and fluid identities in discourse. One of the complexities of identity formation in discourse is that individuals possess multiple, overlapping identities that shift depending on the social context. These identities can include personal, professional, cultural, ethnic, gender, and class-based identities, among others. Discourse analysis explores how people manage these identities and how they are sometimes in tension with each other. Code switching and identity. Code switching, the practice of shifting between different languages, dialects, or registers, illustrates how individuals manage multiple identities in discourse. People often switch between linguistic forms depending on the social setting or the audience, thereby signaling different aspects of their identity. Discourse analysts study how these shifts in language reflect the speaker's need to navigate different social roles or cultural expectations. Example: a bilingual speaker might use one language at home with family and another at work, signaling different cultural or social identities in each context. Discourse analysis would focus on how this code switching reflects the speaker's negotiation of personal and professional identities. Intersectionality in identity construction. In discourse analysis, intersectionality refers to how various aspects of identity, such as race, gender, class, and sexuality, interact and overlap. People do not experience these identities in isolation. Rather, they are intertwined, with each shaping the individual's experiences and discursive practices. Analyzing discourse through an intersectional lens reveals how these multiple identities are constructed, often in complex and sometimes contradictory ways. Example: in a corporate meeting, A woman of color may navigate her identity as a professional, a woman, and a person of color simultaneously. She might employ formal business language to assert her professional identity while resisting or challenging stereotypes associated with her gender and race. Discourse analysis would explore how these intersecting identities influence her speech and how she is perceived by others. Point 3. Identity and power in discourse. Identity formation in discourse is closely tied to power relations, as language plays a key role in maintaining or challenging social hierarchies. Discourse can empower individuals to assert their identities or, conversely, constrain them by positioning them within limiting or stereotypical roles. Power dynamics are constantly negotiated through discourse, influencing how identities are constructed and perceived. Dominant discourses and identity regulation. In any social context, there are dominant discourses that establish norms and expectations for how people should behave or express their identities. These discourses regulate identity by privileging certain ways of being over others. Discourse analysis examines how dominant discourses impose limitations on identity formation, often marginalizing or silencing alternative identities. Example: in media discourse, representations of women may be shaped by dominant gender norms that emphasize beauty and nurturing roles, limiting how female identities are constructed. Discourse analysts would explore how these representations regulate women's identities and marginalize those who do not conform to these norms. Resistance and identity in discourse. While dominant discourses regulate identity, individuals and groups can also use discourse to resist and subvert these norms. Counter-discourses emerge as a way to challenge hegemonic identities and create space for alternative self-representations. Discourse analysis investigates how marginalized groups use language to resist imposed identities and assert their agency. Example: in queer discourse, terms like gender non-conforming or queer challenge the binary understandings of gender and sexuality promoted by dominant discourses. Discourse analysts would explore how these terms reframe identity and resist the regulatory power of mainstream gender norms. Point 4. Identity, ideology, and representation. The construction of identity in discourse is often linked to ideological frameworks. Discourse reflects and perpetuates ideologies that shape how identities are understood and valued within society. Representations of identity in discourse can either reinforce or challenge these ideologies, influencing how people see themselves and others. Media representations of identity. Media discourse plays a significant role in shaping societal perceptions of identity. Through the repetition of certain narratives, images, and language, media constructs representations of social groups that reflect underlying ideological beliefs. Discourse analysis of media texts often focuses on how these representations influence public understanding of different identities and how they may perpetuate stereotypes or inequalities. Example: the portrayal of immigrants in media as illegal or economic burdens reflects a particular ideological stance that frames immigration as a problem. Discourse analysis would investigate how such representations influence public discourse around immigration and contribute to the marginalization of immigrant identities. Identity and nationalism in political discourse. In political discourse, identity is often constructed in relation to national ideologies. Politicians and political institutions use language to create a sense of national identity, often invoking concepts of unity, tradition, or heritage. These discourses can either include or exclude certain groups, defining who belongs to the nation and who does not. Example: in nationalist discourse, phrases like real Americans or patriots construct an identity that is aligned with specific cultural or political values, often excluding those who do not conform to these ideals. Discourse analysis would explore how these identities are constructed through political speeches and media coverage, revealing the ideological underpinnings of nationalism. Point 5. Identity formation in digital and online discourse. The rise of digital communication and social media has created new spaces for identity formation. Online platforms offer individuals the opportunity to experiment with and perform multiple identities, often in ways that differ from face-to-face interactions. Discourse analysis of digital communication focuses on how identity is constructed in virtual spaces, where the boundaries between public and private, personal and professional, are often blurred. Identity performance in social media. Social media platforms provide a space for continuous identity performance, where users curate and present aspects of their identities through posts, images, and interactions. The discursive practices on these platforms allow for both the reinforcement of existing identities and the exploration of new ones. Discourse analysts examine how language, visuals, and other modes of communication are used to construct identities online. Example: a person might use professional language and share achievements on LinkedIn to construct a career-oriented identity, while using more casual language and humor on Instagram to portray a more personal or creative side. Discourse analysis would look at how these different platforms encourage specific forms of identity performance and how individuals navigate these spaces. Anonymity and identity in online communities. In online forums or platforms where anonymity is possible, individuals may experiment with identities in ways that are not possible in offline contexts. This anonymity allows for the performance of identities that may be marginalized or stigmatized in everyday life. Discourse analysis in these settings explores how individuals use language to express these identities and how online interactions shape identity formation. Example: in anonymous online communities for marginalized groups, such as LGBTQ+ forums, participants may feel freer to express aspects of their identity without fear of judgment. Discourse analysts would examine how the language used in these communities fosters a sense of belonging and how participants negotiate their identities in relation to both the online and offline world. 6. Examples of identity formation in discourse analysis. Example 1. Gender identity in workplace discourse. In a corporate meeting, a female manager may navigate gendered expectations by balancing assertive and collaborative language. Discourse analysis might explore how she constructs her identity as both a leader and a woman, highlighting how language reflects the negotiation of gendered professional roles in a male-dominated space. Example 2. National identity in political speeches. A politician delivering a speech on national security might construct an identity that aligns with patriotism and strength, using language that appeals to shared national values. Discourse analysts would explore how this identity is constructed through rhetorical devices such as metaphor and repetition, and how it resonates with the audience's sense of national identity. Example 3. Online identity in social media profiles. A user's social media profile on a professional network like LinkedIn might emphasize achievements, credentials, and professional goals, constructing an identity that is aligned with career success. Discourse analysis would examine how this identity is shaped by the platform's discursive conventions and how the user's language reflects broader societal norms around professionalism. Conclusion: identity formation in discourse analysis reveals the complex ways in which individuals and groups use language to construct, negotiate, and perform their identities. Through discourse, people position themselves in relation to others, manage multiple and sometimes conflicting identities, and engage with broader social ideologies and power structures. By analyzing identity in discourse, researchers uncover the dynamic and fluid nature of identity, exploring how it is shaped by cultural norms, power relations, and the contexts in which communication occurs. Whether examining workplace interactions, media representations, or digital communication, discourse analysis highlights the crucial role language plays in the ongoing construction of identity. Frequently asked questions. What is identity formation in discourse analysis? Identity formation in discourse analysis examines how individuals and groups construct, negotiate, and express their identities through language. Discourse serves as a social practice that allows people to define themselves, adopt or resist social roles, and align with or challenge cultural norms. In this context, identity is seen as fluid, dynamic, and context-dependent, shaped by interactions, power relations, and ideologies. How does discourse contribute to identity construction? Discourse contributes to identity construction by providing the linguistic tools individuals use to define who they are and how they relate to others. Through language, people position themselves in specific social roles, adopt certain identities, and express their beliefs and values. Discourse is not just a reflection of identity but an active site where identity is continuously performed and renegotiated. What is positioning theory in discourse analysis? Positioning theory explains how individuals use language to adopt roles and positions within social interactions. By choosing specific linguistic forms, individuals claim or resist certain identities and assign identities to others. For example, a teacher in a classroom might position themselves as an authority figure through formal language and directive speech, while students are positioned as learners through their questions and deference. How is identity relational in discourse? Identity is relational because it is formed through social interactions rather than existing independently. People construct their identities in relation to others, aligning or contrasting themselves with specific social groups, categories, or roles. For example, in a workplace setting, an employee may align themselves with management by using professional language, distinguishing themselves from colleagues who use more informal language. What is the role of code switching in identity formation? Code switching is the practice of shifting between different languages, dialects, or registers depending on the social context or audience. It illustrates how individuals manage multiple identities in discourse. For example, a bilingual speaker might use one language at home and another at work, signaling different cultural or social identities in each context. Discourse analysis examines how these shifts in language reflect the negotiation of various identities. How does intersectionality influence identity in discourse? Intersectionality in discourse analysis refers to the interaction and overlap of various aspects of identity, such as race, gender, class, and sexuality. Individuals do not experience these identities in isolation. They are intertwined, shaping experiences and discursive practices. Discourse analysis through an intersectional lens reveals how multiple identities are constructed, often in complex and sometimes contradictory ways. How do power dynamics affect identity formation in discourse? Power dynamics influence identity formation by regulating how individuals can express their identities. Dominant discourses establish norms that privilege certain identities while marginalizing others. For instance, media representations of women may emphasize beauty and nurturing roles, limiting how female identities are constructed. Conversely, individuals and groups can use discourse to resist and subvert these norms, asserting alternative identities. What is the impact of dominant discourses on identity? Dominant discourses establish norms and expectations for behavior and identity expression, regulating identity by privileging certain ways of being. These discourses can limit identity formation by marginalizing or silencing alternative identities. For example, in the workplace, dominant discourses may favor professional behaviors associated with particular gender or cultural norms, impacting how individuals construct their professional identities. How can discourse be used to resist and subvert dominant identities? Discourse can be used to resist and subvert dominant identities through the creation of counter-discourses. Marginalized groups use language to challenge hegemonic norms and assert alternative identities. For example, queer discourse challenges binary understandings of gender and sexuality promoted by dominant discourses. Discourse analysis explores how such language practices create space for diverse identities. How do media representations shape identity? Media representations play a significant role in shaping societal perceptions of identity by constructing narratives, images, and language that reflect ideological beliefs. Through repetition, media can perpetuate stereotypes or influence public understanding of different social groups. For instance, media portrayal of immigrants as illegal or economic burdens frames immigration in a particular way, impacting public discourse around immigrant identities. How is identity formed in digital and online discourse? Digital communication and social media provide new spaces for identity formation, allowing individuals to experiment with and perform multiple identities. Online platforms offer users the opportunity to curate and present aspects of their identities through posts, images, and interactions. Discourse analysis of digital communication examines how language and visuals are used to construct identities in virtual spaces, where public and private boundaries often blur. How does anonymity in online communities affect identity formation? Anonymity in online communities allows individuals to experiment with identities that may be marginalized or stigmatized in offline contexts. This anonymity can provide a space for expressing aspects of identity without fear of judgment. Discourse analysis in these settings explores how language is used to express identities and how online interactions shape the construction of identity. What is an example of identity formation in political discourse? In political discourse, identity is often constructed in relation to national ideologies. Politicians use language to create a sense of national identity by invoking concepts of unity, tradition, or heritage. For example, phrases like "real Americans" construct an identity aligned with specific cultural or political values. Discourse analysis examines how these identities are constructed and the ideological underpinnings of nationalism.